Hello everyone and welcome back to the Triple Crown Wargaming Studio, where you join me, James The Loremaster Lamin, for another instalment of 20-0 Tactics, and an episode that I'm christening, if you will, The Art of Artillery. So in today's episode we're going to look at the 5 different types of artillery that are prevalent in the game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Now, we're going to break it down, we're going to talk about each piece individually, we're going to cover how best to deploy them, the best targets for them in each of your games, and then we're going to finish up with the general tactics for shooting them. So I'm not going to mess around or hang about, we're going to get stuck in straight away and we're going to start with the cannon. So you can see we've got some of my Zufbar dwarves here, and right in the middle we've got our cannon. So we're going to start by talking about how best to deploy your cannons. So first and foremost, cannons like to be deployed as far away from your enemies as possible. So you see this is my board edge here. Now imagine we've got our enemies in front of us. The cannon, it wants to be, back. You can see I've chucked it here in the middle and I've been a bit loose with that. But it wants to be a long way away. Now, you do need to remember with a cannon that you need to be able to see the point where you want the cannonball to be placed, right? So you need to think about firing lanes. You'll notice here I've left some space, and there's some space here too, and there's even a bit of space here. So this cannon is okay. If I pulled it back, say here, for example, well, if my enemy was this large Karl Franz, very exciting, he was popped across, say here, it's going to be really difficult for me because my actual cannon is really struggling to see anywhere. Probably difficult for you guys at home to see, but it's really struggling to see anywhere that from the end of the barrel over here that I can place this cannonball to take my shot. So that's the next most important thing, and Mr. Franz, you will return at later points during today's video. Now, the back corners of your deployment zones, they can be really strong places for cannons. Now I know I've got the hill here, but let's just move that for a second, pop it there. So imagine that if our deployment zone finished where this piece of paper ends, getting it right back here is really good because I've got a lot of you can see here I've got a lot of field of fire that would be able to come across the table, and similarly if this building wasn't here, obviously with the building here it's not a lot good, but we'll touch more on that later. Back corners are really good though, and if you've got 2 they're even better. If you imagine I can put a second one here represented by the crew, I can create a kind of cross lane of fire as well. So again, we're talking about being far back all the time. That's going to be what we keep talking about, far from our enemies. Now elevated positions are the optimised spot for this. So we want to be far from the enemy. If we can get in corners or in places where we can see through plenty of firing lanes, that's ideal. And doing that from an elevated position is really good. So hills, they're a number 1 choice. So you can see here, this is a really strong place. It's nice and far back, this hill. Here I've got that elevated position, so I can see when I get down to the model's eye view, I can see a lot more of these table areas to place my cannonball. I can shoot over my own troops. They're not intervening in terms of stopping me from seeing the point. And even better than all of that is, of course, a building, but only if it is reasonably deep inside your deployment zone, like this one, I can defend it. And that's good, so good because you take the point of shooting from anywhere in this building. So right up here at the top, I'm even going to be able to look and draw a line of sight to like points like here. I can literally drop cannonballs right in front of my own troops. That's absolutely amazing. So when deploying, it needs to be far away. It needs to be able to, you need to think about what it can see, and it realistically wants to find itself in one of these elevated positions. So we'll leave it on there for now. Now let's talk about the best targets for cannons in the game. And Max is going to slide across now and show you a very exciting group of targets I've made up. Now they are from some different armies, but that doesn't really matter. The crucial element is, you'll have spotted, is that there's lots of different unit types here. Now, cannons do a hit at strength 10, it does multiple wounds, d6, but it is just one thing being hit, one model or anything in the line of the bounce rather. Now, as you can probably have worked out, single models with very high number of wounds and a high value are the best targets for your cannons. So we want you to think monsters, enemy characters on monsters. So Mr. Franz is really in trouble. Things like this chariot, for example, are another really good. Now, if your enemy has cannons or artillery pieces of their own, sometimes the best target, or certainly the first target, should be their piece of artillery. And again, it's because they are, when you shoot at them, treated as a single model with a lot of wounds that has good value. And the value in points might be low for something like that trebuchet, but if it hits and kills your cannon, or hits and kills one of your best units, the damage it does, the potential value of it is huge. So that's your prime goal targets, guys. Now after that, you're looking at enemies with perhaps high armor saves being the place to go next. So it's worth remembering when I say this that if a cannonball hits cavalry or infantry, the cannonball doesn't stop. If you put the cannonball, so here, it overshoots and then bounces, it hits everyone under that line. It doesn't just hit that first model if he passes his save. So anything that's high value that you can hit sort of through is worth considering. It's not going to be as optimised a target as those first three, but it can still be really good. Now, monstrous infantry, you see I've got some here. I think they're a real trap for the cannon, and I want to tell everyone about this. I'll sing it from the rooftops. Because they stop the cannonball, if you hit the first guy and you don't kill him because you don't do enough wounds, or he passes his regen, say if he's got one, like these Cryptoris, no one else is hit, I think what you often find is you shoot monstrous infantry and, well, actually the cannonball doesn't really do anything for you, but you got it into your head that because they had lots of wounds and because you've got lots of damage, your D6, multiple wounds, it was a good choice. It wasn't. And the last thing I want you to think about is, talks about primacies being these three, but don't miss the opportunity for a flank shot on something like knights. If we've got these knights galloping across, say here, we come back, oh, look at this. This is a thing of beauty. We can drop our cannonball, we can fire it through, and we can hit like 5 guys. And that's a lot of value that we can kill there. So never miss the opportunity for a flank shot. And even big regiments of infantry, like our greatswords over here, again, if we think about that, if we can clip the flank shot on them, well, we could potentially kill 10 models, and suddenly you've turned the cannon into a threat against even basic troops, which wasn't what you were expecting, I'm sure. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention with the sort of best targets is cannon sniping. Now, this is a really filthy, unkind, unpleasant tactic, Max is coming back to my face, that we've all done in competitive games if we own a cannon, and then felt a little bit bad about it afterwards. And it involves looking down here at, say, the Archlector in the front of my unit, and popping the cannonball in such a way that it will hit him and they'll have to take a lookout save. And obviously if he fails that, then it might simply kill him, and he turns into one of these then. He turns into a high value, big wound target. So it's worth remembering you can do it, and sometimes you will be looking at a game and thinking, I really need to find those points, maybe if I can get the enemy general or vampire or something like that. You'll be tempted, and maybe you should. So it's an option, but it always comes after big, single, high value targets for your cannon. So let's talk about general tactics for shooting your cannon. I want you to remember that you must be able to see the point on the ground that you want to shoot at. So when you place a cannonball, you pop a point on the ground, you roll your artillery dice, which I should have to hand, but I don't, and it jumps forward the overshoot. That first point, the first place you drop it, you need to be able to see, and that's why we talked about elevated positions. Now, in Triple Crown events, you can't fire a cannon at a target you can't see. So you can't sort of go, oh, well, I think that there's something over that hill, or for example, if we had something like these, say we were shooting dwarf on dwarf here for a minute. If we move this like this, and we've got this one remaining dwarf handgunner there, and our cannon's over here, up the sort of catch of the hill, you're going to find that if we get down to model's eye view, I can't actually see him. He's completely obscured. I can't just go, well, I'm going to pop the cannonball here and shoot over the wall, because over the hill, in case there's someone there, because that's not realistic, is it? You wouldn't just fire a cannon in a random direction. So at our events, and others do the same, you're not allowed to do that. So you need to remember that. Now, remember that any conventional artillery piece, like the cannon, can be pivoted before you shoot it. And that's done in the shooting phase. Don't forget that. It's really important if you're looking at a target and you think, oh, actually, I can pivot it, because your cannonball does need to remain in a straight line from the barrel, which is the next really important point. It can't sort of deviate or curve around a corner. It's got to be a straight line from the barrel. So that pivot is really important, especially for the cannon, because it has that whole straight line mechanic. Now, the final thing I'm going to talk about is is the kind of raw mechanics of shooting the cannon, and that is the infamous tactic 10 inches from the back. So you take your monster, like Mr. Franz, he's here, he's cutting up big, as they might say, and you decide you want to shoot a cannon at him. Now, what spot on the ground should you be aiming at? Now, I know that the vast majority of you will know all about this tactic, but I'm going to just cover it, and it is this. You should take your tape measure. You should measure 10 inches from the back of the base, and that is the spot on the ground that you should place your initial cannonball. Then when you fire your overshoot and your bounce. Now we do that because if you roll a 10 on the overshoot, it means the cannonball will still land on the back of his base, which means that you will still hit him. So this is, in a very real sense, a way to pretty much guarantee hitting the target unless you fall incredibly short. And if we look at something like Franz, he's on a 100mm deep base there. So, you know, we've realistically got to roll a 2 and a misfire or a 2 and a 2 to not actually hit his base if we do that. So it becomes very hard to miss if you shoot like that. Now the final point I'm going to make is about grape shot. Now it's an option for cannons where you shoot an artillery dice number of shots at the ballistic skill of the crew. I'm going to be really honest with you guys. Don't do this. It's rarely a good choice. Maybe against the unit of multiple models like fast cavalry that are threatening the cannon, you think, well, I'll do it because I'm going to lose the cannon anyway. But realistically, this should almost never be the thing you do. Even if you think you're going to lose the cannon, if you've got a better shot at one of those high value targets, take it and lose the cannon and hope that you score the VPs there. And the only other thing I'm going to mention very quickly, which I don't have with me, is a note on sort of chariot cannons. So I'm thinking about the skull cannon, or I'm thinking about the iron blaster for the ogre kingdoms. Now these guys can move and shoot. Now that's a huge advantage, and then because it will make sort of finding a legal shot or a favourable shot a lot easier for you, because you've got that sort of 8 inches or 7 inches you can slide before you go. You do need to pivot that at the end though, because they are not an artillery piece. They don't benefit from being able to pivot in the shooting phase because they're not artillery, they're chariots. So you need to make sure you're facing the direction that you're shooting at. But they're really great. Steam Tank's another one thinking about it. They're really great as part of a mobile force. If you're going to try and step forward with your army, just think about Empire, Demons of Khorne. These are really great because they can just move up and keep firing. So that's it. That's cannons covered. We're now going to have a chat about stone throwers. Okay, so we're moving on now to the stone thrower, and for today we're going to be using our humble dwarf grudge thrower to represent it. So how best to deploy a stone thrower? Well, very much like the cannon, stone throwers like to be deployed farthest away from the enemy as possible, and this is because they've got a minimum range of 12 inches, which means anyone that gets within 12 can't be shot at. So they definitely want to be as far back as possible. Excellent. Now, with a stone thrower, you don't even need to see the target you're shooting at. So you do want to, it's preferable to see them because you will scatter less if you can, but it's not a necessity. So you can be even thinking about hiding the stone thrower completely out of line of sight. Like this, where most of the enemy wouldn't be able to see it. Now, what's really good about that is that works very effectively against enemies that have got lots of blocked up units kind of tightly packed, because it's going to always scatter if you can't see the target, but it's probably still going to hit quite a lot of stuff if you've got a lot of enemy blocks tightly packed. Now, behind a friendly unit is a really great place for the stone thrower, or the grudge thrower in this case, because you can still see most targets at range, because bear in mind that within 12 they can't shoot anyway. You'll still be able to see most of the targets that you want to aim at, and they're very well protected by the blocks in front of them. We don't need to think about firing lanes because we only need to see with true line of sight. Now, like with many of the other pieces you're going to see, whilst the hill doesn't offer a great deal for the grudge thrower, the building will. The building is ace once again, because you've got that huge field of vision, because you've got 360 from that really tall place. So it's another really good place to put it, providing it's deep in your deployment zone and you can defend it. If you don't have a building, then I would recommend behind friendly units, and with the ability to draw a line of sight, but it's not a necessity, but it is better. Now, Let's have a look at the best targets for our stone throwers in game. So we go back to our target wall over here now, or our target block, I suppose. Now, stone throwers are arguably the most versatile piece of artillery in the game, with a high strength in the middle, strength 9, and multiple wounds d6 under the whole of the small round template, which they fire. There should always be a target for them, because effectively they're really good against monsters and single high value targets, like the pieces we looked at a moment ago for the cannon, because that centre hull is strength 9, multiple wounds d6, almost identical to the cannon's damage. But that blast template, that small round 3-inch template, is excellent for striking regiments too. Now let's grab ourselves a template to show you exactly what we're talking about when we look at those blocks. Typical, you're grabbing around for one, you can't find it. There we go. So, if we look here and we start looking at big blocks of infantry, you guys can see from the angle there the amount of models. Now I have to put someone's head under the hull, but look at the amount of figures that we can hit. Max will probably be able to tell you how many are under that template right now, but I imagine it will be probably around 18 or 20.
Probably 18.
18.
Yeah.
So you can see. And that's actually where you're probably going to find your biggest impact from your stone throwers, is shooting them at low armoured, low value enemy infantry blocks. I want you to think about Empire, I want you to think about Skaven, but really what I want you to think about is the army that hates the stone thrower most, and that is elves. Because elves are expensive, they have low armour, and they're toughness 3, which means when that template lands and hits 20, 18, 15 models, it does huge damage. Now, it's not the most accurate piece of artillery you're going to find, because it does move on a scatter and artillery dice, and so it can sort of go quite wild. After all, it will only land a direct hit 1/3 of the time. But again, as I talked about earlier, if you've got lots of blocks ranked up together, we'll cover more of that in the general tactics, you'll find a really good source of joy for yourself with your stone throwers. Now, enemy artillery, as we had earlier, can also be viable because of the multiple wounds d6. And if I'm honest, generally the thing that I wouldn't realistically want to shoot these at is monstrous infantry and cavalry. And that's because the low strength on the burst, it's only strength 3 on a conventional stone thrower template, will struggle to get through the armour. You're also going to hit a lot less models than when you hit a block of ranked up infantry, and it's exactly the same problem with the monstrous infantry or monstrous cavalry even, is you're not going to hit as many models, and you get one under the hull like that, you're going to hit maybe 6 on a really good day if it doesn't scatter, and you're going to struggle to wound them with the toughness and then their multiple wound models, so you're going to struggle to have a real impact like that. Now the exception to that would be to think about something like the field trebuchet, slightly different because it's got the strength 5 under the hull template and strength 10 under the hull, which means that it can threaten cavalry. But in general, if you're using a regular stone thrower, the best choice is to aim at those blocks of infantry and some of those higher value targets if you feel like you haven't got a better option for killing them. So let's think about our general tactics for shooting a stone thrower. Now first things first, I want you to remember that conventional artillery can pivot before it is fired in the shooting phase, which will allow you to get a better chance to keep line of sight on your target. Now, you don't need to see the target as I mentioned earlier, but if you can't see the target that you shoot with the stone thrower, you will always scatter. Even if you roll a hit, the arrow on the hit symbol will be the direction that you run off at. Now, the shot will hit 2/3 of the time, so if you have access to improving that ratio, it might be worth it. Now, dwarves, they can have runes, and engineers. There's not many armies that can improve stone thrower shooting, but if there is an option, it's worth considering it because it doesn't hit as often. Now, as I said, the scatter is a real risk with stone throwers. Unlike a lot of the other artillery, it has a really good chance of actually hitting your own troops if you're not careful. So you need to make sure that when we're shooting, for example, if we go back to our infantry block and we borrow over here, if we start trying to shoot our grudge thrower here at these guys, we are taking some huge liberties because we may find that we end up over here in our own dwarves very quickly. It's a big risk, so we have to be really careful about that. But as I said earlier, we can use some of that to our advantage. Now, if we imagine all of these troops are actually our enemy for a moment, firing our grudge thrower, say here, is a really good choice, because there's a good chance the scatter, if it goes either of the kind of sideways motions, will still hit lots of targets. So we want to think about that. We want to target things that are further away from our infantry and our valuable targets, and that ideally are packed with other viable targets around them, so that you can minimise the kind of the risk, or if you like, of the scatter. And that's it. That's the tactics for shooting a stone thrower. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to take a look at the tactics for shooting volley guns. So we're going to take a look at volley guns now, and the last time I'll be using the dwarves today for our demonstration elements. So volley guns are generally much lower range than the other pieces of artillery we've looked at so far. Be 24 or 30 in the case of the organ gun. Now, unlike the others, they shoot using ballistic skill as well. So, again, the crew's ballistic skill in this case is going to matter. And it does require line of sight to the enemy to remove hit modifiers, or to be able to shoot at all. So, again, thinking about sort of stuff blocking you off. If we were shooting, wanted to shoot, say, these knights, but we had a nice alliance here, obviously. Karl Franz hanging in front, he is going to provide them with a -2 to hit modifier, that terrible hard cover modifier in this case. So those are really important elements we haven't seen with the previous pieces of artillery. Now, my optimised deployment as a result of all of this is between your blocks, but tucked behind the front line of your firing units. This creates a firing lane here of good width without any sort of impact on the cover ratings from your own units. You'll notice that I'm 1 inch behind the front line, and I'll be 1 inch away, and these actually could, because I'm on trays, could come in a little bit closer. And this is really important that we're 1 inch away, because what we don't want is to have a really big gap that an enemy unit like these knights could come sprawling into and charge us. That is very, very bad. What we want to see is this nice tight gap here, like this, so that they can't make the charge. You see they're blocked. If Max can get a little bit out of an angle, you'll see there's just no way. They're too wide for the gap. That's really important, because it means that realistically you're going to struggle with anything that's wider than maybe a chariot base to actually charge our organ gun. You're going to have to charge the blocks first. This is the best way to defend it whilst keeping the optimised firing lane. And again, it needs to be further forward, as I mentioned earlier, because it has that shorter range for its shooting. Now, a building inside your deployment zone, like we discussed with the other pieces of artillery, can work really well again, as can a hill. If you pop it like this, you can pop the volley gun on the hill. You can have these guys at the bottom of the hill, and you'll be able to shoot over the top of your own unit. Now, they won't impinge you for cover, and as long as the enemy doesn't have a flying model with a very small base, they'll still have to get through one of your regiments first. So that can work really nicely, and it's probably slightly better than this, but you can always guarantee this shape is available. Again, exactly the same tactic with the building that we talked about with the cannon. You can fire from the building, and actually ideally you'd like the building to be a bit closer to the edge of your deployment zone this time, but you're going to want to make sure you block it off and defend it, because otherwise you make the volley gun very easy to kill. But the height and the range, the height and the line of sight rather from that building will be worth considering. Now, something else that you can do with the volley gun that you can't do with a lot of the other artillery is you can create control zones. So you can take your volley gun, and actually I'm going to pair it up now. I'm going to show you something. So imagine our dwarf battle lines over here. Our volley gun's quite a long way away, but actually we've got this cannon as well. We've put that in the corner of our deployment zone like we talked about earlier, because it's a good firing position for us. But we want to make sure it's safe, so we can actually use the volley gun to keep it safe. We can pop that here. And what we've done is created a 30-inch control zone, because the volley gun can pivot. Nice and big, actually, bigger than that, yeah. Anything that comes in there to try and get our cannon can get volley gunned. This is great. This is a tactic we can't do with our other artillery pieces. Now the trade-off, of course, is that if their opponent does get in, well, they're going to get 2 expensive pieces of artillery for very low effort. But most light cavalry, most small threats will struggle to get through the output of the volley gun, defending that control zone. So what you often find when you do this sort of tactic is people just stay away from it. And so what you've done is create an area of the board that you've denied to your opponent without ever firing a shot. It can be a really useful tactic, and it's something that you should consider because you can't do it with the other pieces we're going to discuss today. So let's take a look at the best targets for your volley gun in each game. So I'm going to slide some things out of the way. I'm going to pop our target block back together for us to have another little look. Volley guns are a reasonably versatile piece of artillery. They generally do a number of shots, whether it be 2 artillery dice worths or 3 artillery dice worth, or if we're thinking about repeater bolt throwers, 6 shots, but more on that later. Which means they can threaten a wide range of targets. They can cause problems for infantry. They can even, because they'll be strength 5 normally, cause problems for chariots. And most definitely, their number one hot take problem is for cavalry. They do like to shoot a bit of cavalry. In fact, that's because in general, high value enemies with a good saving throw are the most valuable target for a volley gun. And that's because they generally will take 3 off the armour save as well, because they'll be strength 5 and usually armour piercing. So they'll get through the armour and they'll kill the value, which is what you want. So cavalry number 1 target, expensive infantry, think about things like blackguard, they hate that, no armour save, 2s to kill, loads of points available there. Enemy elite infantry I've just mentioned, and heavy cavalry worth thinking about first, but as I said, you can have a quick look at chariots and even monstrous infantry, something like the crypt horrors, particularly if you can get some flaming shots on them first, which we'll talk more about later, just because the volume of hits are good strength that they will do. As ever, I just want you to remember that you must always hit on ballistic skills, so try to avoid shooting at enemies in cover or skirmishers. Skirmishers are a terrible target for a volley gun, so you're better to fire at the blocks, and if they're being blocked off, well, let's talk about that in the general tactics for shooting a volley gun. So first things first, I'm going to remind you once again that your artillery can pivot at the start of its shooting phase if it's conventional like the volley gun. So it gives you a chance to get a little more line of sight. If they're creeping over here and they're just creeping out, you can do that. And then maybe move these back, and if you move these back slightly in your movement phase, you can pivot it slightly to make sure you can keep your arc of sight looking strong. Now, unlike other pieces of artillery, you're going to need to make sure that your own units don't provide any cover for the enemy. That would be a terrible thing to do. Imagine you've got the cavalry running in here, and you know they're coming, and so what you do is you push these up to try and stop them getting your volley gun. What a disaster. Your volley gun can't shoot. It can't. Well, it can shoot, but it's going to suffer a -2 penalty whilst doing it. That's a shocking decision. Don't do that. That's awful. Now, if your army has access to engineers, this is a really good place for them, the volley gun, because upping the ballistic skill on this and stopping it from misfiring will mean it kicks out so many shots. And as we said, its best target is actually high value, powerful enemy troops. So you're going to get a lot of points and you're going to blunt your opponent's army with a volley gun. And then the other thing I want you to think about is clearing fire lanes. You'll notice that next to my volley gun I've got some handguns here, and that's really important. It's important because, for example, if I've got, let's have a little think, if I've got another something in front, I'm trying to think of what could do a good job here. I've got the remnants of a unit of infantry in front of my cavalry. I know these are different armies, but I just want you to think about this. Now at the moment, they're providing hard cover, as you can see, for the cavalry that I want to shoot with my volley gun. Now that's what these guys are really good for. They shoot first if I've got some quarrelers or other shooting in other armies. They kill these guys, and they've cleared me a fire lane for the volley gun. It's really, really vital to getting the most out of them. So I think definitely think about light shooting when taking a volley gun to pair with it to help you get the most out of it. And that's it. That's our tactics for the volley gun. So we move on now to our penultimate artillery piece, the bolt thrower. So on to bolt throwers now. We're going to begin as ever with how best to deploy your bolt thrower. Now bolt throwers have 48 inches of range, and they generally like to be deployed, well, again, quite far away from the enemy. They don't really want to get close to their enemy because they've got good range. Now, Bolt throwers fire with ballistic skill, like we talked about with the volley gun, so you do need to be able to see your target, and you do need to think about things that are blocking line of sight or that could obscure line of sight. So again, if we look here, you know, this is not so good. So I really think bolt throwers are the undisputed king for me of the elevated position, okay? So again here, this is the ideal. Suddenly the archers and the sea guards positioning doesn't actually have any effect on us. It's because, well, only so far that those knights might go through us, but that's a side point. It doesn't have any effect on us because we can see over the top of them. And even better is the fabled building in your deployment zone, ladies and gentlemen. That is the apex location for the bolt thrower in a way, because it's got the good range and it's then in hard cover and it can do its thing without the risk of being blocked off by its own men or women if you're using Sisters of Avalon and this sort of army. Now, another really good tactic for the bolt throwers, particularly if you've got a pair, is to bring them onto the ends of your battle lines. So you can use a board edge or you can use 2 units to create the same type of shape that we had earlier, where we create a really small aperture for the enemy to be able to attack the bolt thrower. But what's really good about this is that, again, we can create those crisscrossing patterns of fire. Imagine I've got a second one just here, crisscrossing patterns of fire. So we're keeping our line of sight good, and we're sort of being able to hit lots of the same target here. So it can work really well. But like I say, optimised, always going to be building. Second best place, going to be elevated position. Then if not, as we talked about, ensure you've got fire lanes. Some of the stuff we discussed on the volley gun section can be really good here too. So let's think about the best targets for your bolt throwers. I'll take Max over to my blocks of targets once again. Now, bolt throwers shoot a single shot at strength 6. Now, that shot doesn't allow armour saves and does multiple wounds D3. Furthermore, the bolt thrower has an effect where it pierces ranks. So if it kills the first model it hits, the one behind it in a line from the bolt thrower takes a hit afterwards at the strength of the bolt thrower minus the number of ranks you've pierced. I'm being very loose there. So imagine here, we hit the first guy, he's hit at strength 6, it kills him, it goes through, it hits this guy at strength 5, hits this guy at strength 4, hits this guy at strength 3. Now it does have to kill the model in front to keep going, but all of the hits are no armour saves, so it's worth bearing in mind too. So what does all of this mean for targets? Well, to be honest, it means that a target that's got good armour, because you ignore armour, and has a high value, like cavalry, is particularly spicy for the bolt thrower. Again, blocks of expensive infantry that have got good armour, warriors of chaos, great swords even to an extent with their 4+, are probably the next best target because you can pierce the ranks and do damage. Now these are in a horde, but imagine they were in a bus, you'd get even more joy that way. Now, I have to say this, don't get drawn into the idea of monstrous cavalry with these guys. So if we swap those crypt horrors for some demigryph knights, say, or imagine those crypt horrors have got a really good armour save, you might be tempted to shoot at them and think to yourself, well, I ignore armour, which is great, but you're only doing multiple wounds D3, and these are 3 wound models. The likelihood is, statistically, you won't kill one, let alone pierce a rank and do more, and you'll end up feeling like you wasted the shot. Now, these guys will also, unfortunately, bolt throwers will feel like they really are lackluster against monsters and artillery pieces as well. The high toughness of artillery, being only strength 6, means that you struggle to get through, and if I'm honest, with monsters, you can do it against monsters, but you do need to take 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 to really have a good shot at killing a monster. When you're only strength 6, you're only multiple wounds D3, and you've still got a hit on ballistic skill. So we'll reiterate: cavalry number 1, expensive infantry number 2, and if we think about the cannon earlier, if we're looking at that piercing ranks mechanic, if we're shooting the front of these cavalry, we can kill 2 knights. But if we can see a side shot, the infamous barbecue shot, if you will, you'll have seen me do this with orcs and goblin spear chuckers against the Bretonnian knights. Well, we could kill up to 5 knights, and so this is when I talked earlier about being on the end of your battle lines, how good it can be for you. Because if you imagine, you've got these knights now sweeping over towards our archers, and all of a sudden, oh, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. We're hitting the flank facing, which means that the bolt goes that way, and we get that barbecue shot, which is great. So that's got to be our absolute optimised shot. He's down the flank of an expensive, wide unit. So well armoured, expensive, like knights, down the flank. Oh, you love to see it, ladies and gentlemen. That, without a doubt, is going to be our best target for the bolt thrower. So, general tactics for shooting our bolt throwers. I'm going to say it again, you're going to get bored of hearing it, but remember, ladies and gentlemen, conventional artillery can pivot before it's fired. So if it's not in this shiny building, if it's up on this hill, it can turn to face to get the line of sight that it needs to shoot its enemy over there. Imagine it was facing this way from last turn. Oh, we pivot that to start the shooting phase. Everyone's having a good time. Don't forget that it can do that. It's very important. Now, unlike other artillery, you do need to ensure your own units do not provide cover for the enemy. So getting it on a hill, elevated positions, all the things we talked about earlier. I want you to always look for those flank shots that I just mentioned. And I want you to think about using other shooting in your army to clear firing lanes for the bolt thrower. So we might be able to see over this. But if we had some models right in front of our cavalry like this that are going to charge out of the way, we might find that they're blocking the line of sight for our bolt thrower if we were to say here, yeah? That's not good for us, that's giving them hard cover. We don't want that. So we want to use, again, our light troops, our light bows. We've got archers and sea guard here, both have bows, to clear these out of the way first. So the order in which we shoot is important. So again, with bolt throwers, I would always pair it with some kind of lighter shooting from my core or from maybe the special slot, whatever you've got. But I want you to think about bows, crossbows, all those sort of things. Now, I'm going to make a quick note. I've used an elf bolt thrower for this demonstration, and at no point have I talked about the fact that it can shoot the multi-bolt. You'll see me, the multi-bolt. That's 6 shots at strength 4 minus armor piercing, so -2 to the save. That shot and the using them like that is very much the same tactical suite, if you like, as the volley gun. So if you're thinking about elf bolt throwers, it's great. We've talked at length about the barbecue shot, the single strength 6 bolt. Now I want you to go back, if you didn't watch the volley gun section, and I want you to watch all the volley gun tactics, and I want you to change all references to volley gun to repeater bolt thrower, because you can do it the same way with them. So the multiple shots, treat them like a volley gun. The single shots, follow the bolt thrower tactics we've just discussed. And that's it. We're going to move on now to our final piece of artillery, and that is a fire thrower. So on to our final piece of artillery, the fire thrower. Now I've got Max's castles for today's demonstration elements, although I must say we haven't demonstrated heavily, we're just showing you some shapes. Now, the fire thrower is the very shortest range of our artillery pieces. You place the flamer template at the end of the barrel, and it can go up to 10 inches forward because you roll the artillery dice and move it that far forward in a straight line. So let's think now about how we deploy them. Well, bearing that in mind, they're going to need to be quite close to the front of our deployment zone because, well, otherwise they're not going to hit anything. And again, we're going to want to create those fire lanes, and you see here I've placed, as I did earlier, if you watch the earlier parts, if you just skip to this, I'll explain it again. The fire thrower is 1 inch behind the front line of our 2 blocks, and it is tucked neatly between the both, which means that anything that's wider than sort of about 50 mil is not actually going to get in the gap, so they're not going to be able to charge it. Keeps it alive for longer. It also creates space for you to shoot the flamer template, which is really important. So not only are you going to want to create the fire lanes, but ideally with the fire thrower you're really going to want to think about those crisscross patterns we discussed earlier, and this will come into sharper focus in a little while. But what it means is getting the fire thrower on the end of the battle line if you can. This is a really good place for a fire thrower. This is an ace place for one, because particularly if this battle line's a little more shooty than the one I've got, because I can now pivot it and get some really exciting angles. And those angles are really important because they're going to allow us to hit a lot more enemies as they come in, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But effectively, this is even better if you've got 2, you know, 1 on each end if you like, crossing across the front of your in like a little wedge shape, like a V, and that's going to mean that you very rarely don't hit a lot of enemies as they try and come in on your battle line. So let's think about the best targets for our fire thrower, and we've got our target board still. Now, the hit from the fire thrower is the teardrop template that you've seen me sliding about. It has a strength 5 hit, which means that unsurprisingly, with a -2 modifier to the armour save and the potential to hit a lot of figures, this is best used on blocks of infantry. I mean, imagine those little sideways runs, the little flank shots, the barbecues like we talked about earlier. I mean, that is a barbecue. That is toasting a lot of models. So, our second best target, if you like, is going to be, realistically, monstrous infantry next. Monstrous infantry in general has lower armour than other targets like knights, and will often rely on saves like regeneration, which don't work against the flaming attacks from the fire thrower. And again, you're still going to hit quite a lot of models if you can get a favourable shot in place. You can easily score 6 or 8 even on a block like this, which is really good. Now I'm going to mention that much more specifically later, but the very first and foremost target should be blocks of infantry, particularly expensive low armoured infantry. I'm looking at elves again, I'm looking at things like your great swords, your grave guard, even things like these Chaos Dwarf warriors. They're not particularly impressed with it. They've got a 3-up save, they're down to a 5+, and this wounds them on a 3, and they're expensive models. Now, it's fair to say that even a unit something like Knights can find the fire thrower scary. It can hit a lot of models, and it will be at least a -2 modifier to their save. So, if they've got a 2-up, it means 50% of what's hit is potentially toast, or toasted, as we like to do on the channel from time to time. But optimise targets, those blocks. So, let's think about our general tactics. Now, remember, guys, for the last time today, conventional artillery pieces can pivot at the start of their shooting phase to get a more favourable angle for their shot. Now, this will help you with line of sight and potentially even cover, but much more with this for line of sight. Now, strangely, you are allowed to risk hitting your own units with a fire thrower. Something I should have mentioned in the cannon section is you can't place a cannonball anywhere where it might hit an ongoing combat or a friendly unit, which can really curtail how you use it, which is why things like the building deployment for the cannon was so strong, because it gives you much vaster range of kind of options, gives you more areas to draw the line of the cannonball from, and it gives you more line of sight. There's no such restriction for the fire thrower, ladies and gentlemen. It's not in there. I've looked. Max is pulling a face at me. He can't believe it. You can barbecue your own mates if you want. So if you're thinking to yourself, oh, these Empire dudes, they've got themselves into a right predicament. They've busted through my battle line. They've overrun like this. Well, don't you worry, ladies and gentlemen. You can turn this way and you can shoot your magma cannon if you want to. You can do it. You don't care. These toasty boys are nothing to you. Now, obviously, this is not the ideal, but it is really worth remembering because fire throwers have a really short range, and so you really do need to get the most out of them. Now, earlier on, I talked to you guys about the benefit of having the fire thrower on the end of your battle line, and this is really where I'm going to break down why that is so strong. And it's because of this, because if I pivot like this and I fire my fire thrower, the further I pivot, the more I kind of do this, the more parallel I'm getting my template to the ranks of my enemy. And the more parallel I get it, the more models I'm going to hit. So shooting a fire thrower on a square enemy like that, well, you know, for a little bit of an overshoot, I could get maybe on a really amazing shot, I could get 16 models there. But if I shoot my fire thrower like this, for example, on a slightly parallel angle, on a short bounce, I'm going to score 3. Well, I've got 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 23 under the template, and it can be even better than that if you can get a really good barbecue and you can use chaff units to pull the enemy into a really unpleasant position, and it's where your Hobgoblin Khans come in really well for your magma cannon, guys. So that's one of the reasons we were thinking about that. It's about getting the template as parallel to the target, or as favourable a shape. If you're fighting a lance of Bretonnian Knights, obviously you want to get it as square to them as possible to shoot down the length of the lance, but it's about getting the template in line with the maximum number of figures. So that's a really important thing to try to consider. And just remember that it has to shoot in a straight line from the end of the barrel. So make sure you think really long and hard about that pivot. If you go like that, it's got to stay, that line's got to stay like that. You see I'm having aggravation doing it just looking at it here. It's where those laser pointers are so useful. Now, I'm just going to finish up with a very short bit on the magma cannon in particular, and the dwarf fire thrower is the same, and I think the Skaven one might also be the same, is that some fire throwers have additional abilities. We're talking about just the template that you place on the end of the barrel and moves forward, an artillery dice and hits at strength 5 with flaming attacks. Some of them have 2 additional abilities. One, which the magma cannon has, is the ability to place the template within a range of the barrel. So if the magma cannon, it starts at 12 and it can go up to 24?
24 place.
Is it 24 place? You don't have to overcharge it for that?
Nope.
Okay, apologies, it's anywhere within 24. You can place that. So you still fire it the same way once you've placed it, and the tactics we talked about are all really still the same. You can still touch the end of the barrel if you want, but you can do it from much further away. So keep your artillery piece safer for longer. Do it from right back here, because you don't care if you toast your own men. We talked about that. You can do it if you want to. Just try not to. The other rule that some fire throwers have, and again I say the Skaven one here and this one, is multiple wounds D3. So for some of these they go under the template. Now I don't want you, going back to our target wall, to get all excited about this and start looking at Mr. Franz and start looking at monsters and chariots. You will not have the result you want. You will do a hit on those targets at strength 5 multiple wounds D3. If the bolt thrower isn't going to kill them on its own, a fire thrower isn't going to. But suddenly earlier we said our second best target was these monstrous infantry. Well, that goes up a whole other level when you've got multiple wounds D3 on the shot. They become possibly the best target because you're decimating huge volumes of troops and doing multiple wounds whilst you do it. I call that the bane of trolls, the magma cannon, just so you know, because they have regeneration 4+, and they have multiple wounds they have three wounds each, and the multiple wounds D3 and flaming is just their enemy. So that's it. We've got through it, we've covered the art of artillery. So to summarise, understanding the ideal target and doing the kind of fundamental tactics we've discussed in this video are the winning formula for artillery. Stick with this and I can assure you you're going to get far more out of the artillery pieces that you use in your armies in your games of Warhammer. And that concludes our episode of 20 Tactics. I hope it's sharpened your artillery tactics and got your engineer's eye in. That's the word I was looking for. Feel free to get in touch through all of our social media platforms and let us know what you think or if it's changed your mind about anything. And head back to the Night of the Realm Mustering Ground to check out more exclusive content on there. Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share. Then head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.
What are you doing, mate?
Are you alright?
Do it for Warhammer!